One of the most confusing experiences people have with avoidance is this painful contradiction. The more deeply the avoidant feels for you, the more distant they sometimes become. And if you do not understand the psychology behind that behavior, you will personalize it. You will assume that distance means lack of love. But in many cases, distance is not the absence of feeling. It is the inability to safely handle the intensity of feeling. That is the paradox of the avoidant mind. See, most people think love naturally creates closeness. For emotionally secure people, that is true. Intimacy feels grounding. Vulnerability creates connection. But for avoidants, intimacy can feel dangerous because love is not just emotional pleasure to them. It is exposure. The moment someone truly matters, the avoidant nervous system begins associating connection with risk. Risk of losing independence. Risk of being controlled. Risk of disappointment. Risk of abandonment. Risk of emotional dependence they cannot regulate. So what happens? The very person they love most begins triggering their deepest emotional defenses. And this is why avoidants often appear calmer, kinder, or even more consistent with people they do not deeply love. Because there is less at stake emotionally. The option feels psychologically safer. The connection stays on the surface. They can engage without feeling consumed. They can maintain control. They can perform affection without confronting vulnerability. But the person they truly love? That person reaches places inside them they have spent years trying to protect. This is why avoidants pull away after moments of closeness. Notice the pattern. Things become emotionally intense. The connection deepens. Vulnerability increases. Maybe the relationship starts feeling serious, stable, or emotionally intimate. And suddenly the avoidant changes. Communication slows down. Emotional walls appear. They become colder, distracted, uncertain, or emotionally unavailable. To the other person, it feels irrational. If you love me, why are you leaving? But from the avoidant's internal experience, closeness itself activates anxiety. Their nervous system confuses intimacy with loss of freedom. Love begins to feel emotionally overwhelming rather than emotionally safe. And here is where people make a devastating mistake. They chase harder. The more the avoidant withdraws, the more they pursue reassurance. More texts, more emotional pressure, more attempts to fix the distance. But psychologically, this often intensifies the avoidant's fear because now the relationship feels even more emotionally consuming. The avoidant does not interpret pursuit the way secure people do. They often interpret it as pressure, expectation, or emotional dependency. Now understand this clearly. Avoidants are not evil. They are defended. There is a difference. Most avoidants learned very early in life that emotional needs were unsafe, ignored, criticized, or overwhelming. So they adapted by becoming self-reliant, independent, emotionally contained. They built an identity around not needing too much from anyone. But then real love enters their life and disrupts that entire structure. Because genuine love demands presence. It demands emotional honesty, consistency, vulnerability, interdependence. And for someone who built survival around emotional distance, that level of closeness can feel like losing control of themselves. So they retreat, not always because they stopped loving you, sometimes because they started loving you more deeply than they know how to handle. And this is why the option often receives the version of them that looks easier, lighter, less conflicted. The option does not activate the same emotional depth. There is no terrifying possibility of emotional exposure, no fear of truly needing someone, no risk of their carefully constructed emotional walls collapsing. But the tragedy is this: avoidants often mistake comfort for compatibility. They think the safer connection must be the better connection because it creates less anxiety. Yet what creates less anxiety also creates less transformation, less depth, and ultimately less meaning. Real love will always confront the parts of you that performance cannot heal. And the avoidant's greatest struggle is that they often run from the very connection their soul has been searching for all along. Because sometimes the strongest feelings do not create closeness first. Sometimes they create fear. What most people don't realize is that avoidants are not reacting to love itself. They are reacting to what love activates inside them. And this is where the distinction between the person they truly love and the option becomes psychologically profound. Because the one they truly love doesn't just make them feel something, that person awakens something. That's the difference. When an avoidant encounters real emotional depth, it doesn't simply register as romance or attachment. It registers as exposure. It reaches into areas of the psyche that were never fully developed in safety. Old emotional imprints start resurfacing, moments where vulnerability wasn't met with comfort, where dependence wasn't safe, where emotional needs felt like a burden. So when genuine intimacy appears in adulthood, it doesn't feel like home at first. It feels like danger dressed as love. And so the mind does something very sophisticated. It creates distance, not because the feeling is absent, but because the feeling is too present, too alive, too consuming. The person they truly love becomes the emotional trigger point for everything unresolved inside them. That person represents depth, intensity, and emotional truth. And with that comes a quiet internal fear. If I fully let this in, I might lose control of myself. So the avoidant begins to unconsciously associate love with loss of control. Now contrast that with the option. The option does not activate the same psychological depth. The connection stays within a manageable emotional range. There is attraction, yes. There is comfort, yes. But there is no full psychological exposure. No deep mirror being held up to the avoidant's internal wounds. The nervous system stays regulated. The emotional stakes remain low. And because of that, the avoidant feels something very important: safety without overwhelm. This is where the confusion begins. Because externally, it may even look like the avoidant is treating the option better. More consistent communication, less emotional turbulence, less withdrawal, more predictability. But internally, this is not depth. It is distance disguised as stability. The option becomes a regulated emotional environment, not a transformative one. Meanwhile, the person they truly love disrupts everything. That love demands presence. It demands emotional accountability. It demands surrender to connection. And for someone whose identity is built around emotional self-protection, that demand can feel like pressure, even when it's coming from genuine love. So what does the avoidant do? They regulate intensity by creating space. They don't leave because they feel nothing. They leave because they feel too much without knowing how to hold it. And here is where the psychological conflict deepens. The avoidant begins to confuse emotional overwhelm with incompatibility. They think, if this feels this intense, maybe it's not right for me. But in reality, intensity is not the problem. It is their capacity to stay present within intensity that has never been fully developed. So they retreat into what feels manageable. The option becomes a form of emotional grounding, not because it is more meaningful, but because it is less demanding on their nervous system. But over time, something subtle happens inside them. The option may provide comfort, but it does not create transformation. It does not challenge their emotional architecture. It does not expand them. It does not break through the walls they built for survival. And because of that, it often lacks depth, the kind of depth that leaves a permanent imprint on the human psyche. Meanwhile, the one they truly love remains unforgettable precisely because they disrupted that inner structure. They were not just a person in the avoidant's life. They were an emotional event, and that is why avoidants often carry a quiet contradiction within them. They move toward what feels safe, but they are internally marked by what felt real. One soothes their nervous system, but the other reshapes their emotional identity. And here is the hard truth most people miss. Avoidance is not the absence of love. It is the mismanagement of emotional intensity. Because what feels safest in the moment is not always what creates the deepest meaning in the long run. And sometimes the person they run from is the only person who ever made them feel completely seen and completely unprepared for what that kind of love requires. That is the paradox they live with, whether they admit it or not. Comfort keeps them stable, but depth is what keeps them awake inside. If you really observe avoidant behavior over time, one of the clearest patterns you will notice is not just who they love, but how differently they communicate that love depending on emotional safety. And nowhere is that contrast more visible than in the difference between the person they truly love and the person who functions as the option. With the one they truly love, communication rarely feels stable. It feels like waves. There are moments of deep emotional closeness where everything feels alive, real, and meaningful. Then suddenly there is silence, distance, emotional withdrawal that seems to come out of nowhere. And for the person on the receiving end, it feels confusing, almost like the connection is being turned on and off without explanation. But from the avoidance internal world, this is not randomness. It is regulation. Because emotional intimacy does not just feel good to them, it builds pressure. The closer someone gets, the more their nervous system starts to register a loss of autonomy. And so, after moments of closeness, the avoidant instinctively pulls back to restore internal balance. It is not calculated manipulation. It is psychological self-protection. So what does that look like externally? Mixed signals. They can be deeply affectionate one day, present, expressive, even vulnerable, and then emotionally unavailable the next. Not because their feelings disappeared overnight, but because their capacity to stay inside emotional intensity has limits they themselves may not fully understand. And this is what creates emotional confusion for the person they truly love. Because love in its healthy form is supposed to feel predictable, safe, consistent. But in this dynamic, love feels like uncertainty wrapped around moments of deep connection. Now contrast that with the option. With the option, the emotional environment is different. It is not that there is no connection, but the depth is controlled, regulated. The avoidant does not feel the same internal threat of emotional engulfment. There's less vulnerability exposed, less psychological pressure, and therefore less need to retreat. And so, paradoxically, their behavior appears more stable. They respond more consistently. They engage more predictably. They may even seem more attentive or available. And to an outside observer, or even to the option themselves, it can look like the avoidant is better with them. But what is actually happening is not emotional depth. It is emotional safety at a distance. There's a version of connection that avoids triggering the avoidant's deepest fears, and that version allows them to stay present without needing to escape. So the consistency is not necessarily a sign of stronger love. It is often a sign of lower emotional activation. This is where people misunderstand avoidance most painfully. They assume consistency equals depth, but in avoidance psychology, consistency often equals containment. With the person they truly love, emotions are not contained. They are activated. The relationship reaches into areas they do not fully control. It brings up longing, fear, attachment, and vulnerability all at once. And because of that intensity, the avoidance system oscillates. Approach, then retreat. Connection, then distance. But with the option, the emotional field is flatter, safer, more predictable. So the avoidant can maintain presence without feeling overwhelmed by it. However, there is an important psychological truth hidden beneath this pattern. The human nervous system remembers intensity more than comfort. The mind may prefer stability, but the psyche remembers impact. And the person who triggers emotional depth, even with all the chaos that sometimes comes with it, leaves a stronger imprint than the person who never pushes those emotional boundaries at all. So over time, the avoidant may find themselves in a strange contradiction. One connection feels easier, smoother, more manageable. The other feels unpredictable but unforgettable. One gives them peace in the moment. The other stays alive in memory. And that is why mixed signals are not just inconsistency, they are a reflection of internal conflict between safety and depth, between regulation and truth, between what feels easy and what feels real. Because when someone truly matters to an avoidant, their presence is not something the nervous system can simply hold steadily. It becomes something the system must repeatedly recalibrate around. And that recalibration is what the outside world experiences as hot and cold behavior. But underneath it all, the pattern is simple. The option is managed, the love is felt, but not always tolerated. And the tragedy is that the very person who experiences the most inconsistency is often the one who mattered the most. Because in avoidant dynamics, stability is not always where love is strongest. It is often where emotion is safest. And safety in their world does not always mean depth. Sometimes it just means distance that feels controlled enough to survive. One of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant psychology is what happens after the distance appears. People often assume that when an avoidant pulls away, they detach completely, that they move on quickly, cleanly, and without emotional residue. But what looks like emotional absence on the outside is often emotional suppression on the inside. Because avoidants are not people who stop feeling easily, they are people who learned how to contain what they feel. And when it comes to the one they truly love, containment does not equal disappearance. In fact, something very different happens internally. Even when they are physically distant, even when communication slows down or stops, even when they convince themselves that space is necessary or for the best, the person they truly love often remains psychologically present. Not as an active conversation, but as an internal reference point. A mental imprint that keeps resurfacing in moments of silence, stress, or emotional vulnerability. They may not express it, they may not acknowledge it, but they think about that person more than they are willing to admit, even to themselves. And this is where the contradiction begins. Outwardly, the avoidant may appear composed. They may seem indifferent, distracted, or even emotionally moved on. But internally, the attachment system does not simply switch off because distance has been created. Instead, it shifts into a quieter, more private form of processing. They replay moments. They revisit conversations. They remember emotional peaks, especially the moments where they felt deeply seen, deeply connected, or unexpectedly vulnerable. And those memories do not disappear just because the relationship is no longer actively maintained. In many cases, suppression actually strengthens internal persistence, because what is not expressed externally does not mean it is not active internally. And here is where the psychological distinction becomes crucial. Avoidants do not process emotions through expression. They process through internal looping, through thought, through reflection they rarely share. So while they may appear emotionally neutral on the surface, their internal world can still be occupied by the person they truly love in a very persistent way. Now contrast this with the option. The option often occupies a different psychological space. They may be present in the avoidant's day-to-day interactions. They may receive attention, communication, and engagement. But the emotional imprint is often lighter, more situational, less psychologically invasive, because the option does not always trigger deep emotional rupture or transformation. They do not always embed themselves in the avoidant's long-term emotional memory in the same way. This is the paradox. The person who is no longer physically present often occupies more psychological space than the person who is. And that is because emotional depth, not proximity, determines imprint. The avoidant mind may convince itself that distance equals resolution, that absence equals emotional closure, but the psyche does not operate with that level of simplicity. It remembers intensity. It remembers emotional activation. It remembers the moments where defenses were lowered, even briefly. And the one who created those moments becomes psychologically unforgettable. This is why avoidants can move through new interactions while still mentally returning to the same emotional reference point. It is not necessarily longing in the romantic sense, it is unresolved emotional imprinting. A part of their internal world remains organized around that connection, even if their external behavior suggests otherwise. And this creates a quiet internal tension, because the avoidant may be living forward in life, but emotionally circling something that still feels unfinished within them. They often rationalize it. They tell themselves stories. It wasn't the right timing. It was too intense. It wouldn't have worked anyway. These thoughts help them maintain emotional control. But beneath those rationalizations, the emotional imprint remains untouched. And this is why the person they truly loved is rarely fully replaced in their internal world, even if their external choices suggest otherwise. Because replacement is external. Imprint is internal. And what leaves an imprint is not who stayed the longest, it is who reached the deepest emotional layers of their identity. So even in silence, even in distance, even in apparent detachment, that connection can remain alive in a way that is invisible to others, but very real within them. And here is the deeper truth. Avoidants don't always miss people in the way others expect. They revisit emotional impact. And the one they truly loved is often not just remembered. They are repeatedly reprocessed in silence, long after the relationship has ended. Because some connections do not fade when they end. They echo. And sometimes the loudest echo is the one that was never fully expressed. One of the most subtle but powerful dynamics in avoidant relationships is this tendency to test love, rather than simply receive it. And this shows up most clearly in how they behave toward the person they truly love versus how they engage with the option. With the person they truly love, avoidants rarely feel emotionally safe enough to just relax into connection. Instead, love becomes something they unconsciously interrogate. They don't always trust stability when it appears, because stability and intimacy feels unfamiliar to a nervous system that was shaped around inconsistency, emotional distance, or unmet needs. So what do they do instead? They test. Not always consciously, not always with intention, but through behavior that creates distance and measures response. They may withdraw emotionally to see if the other person follows. They may go silent to see if love persists without reassurance. They may become inconsistent to test whether the connection survives unpredictability. In their internal logic, if someone truly loves them, that love should remain even when they are not fully present. But what is really happening beneath the surface is not curiosity, it is fear management. Because receiving unconditional emotional presence feels unfamiliar, the avoidance system tries to confirm it repeatedly, almost as if certainty can be proven through endurance. But ironically, the more they test, the more instability they create in the very connection they desire. And this is where the emotional tragedy begins. The person they truly love often experiences these tests not as love, but as confusion. They begin to question themselves. They begin to wonder if they are valued, if they are wanted, if they are enough. Because from the outside, testing looks like distance, not devotion. Yet internally, for the avoidant, these behaviors are often attempts to answer a silent question. Will you still be there if I am not easy to love? Now contrast this with the option. With the option, avoidants often do not feel the same need to test emotional depth. The connection does not trigger the same level of internal threat, so there is less psychological pressure to push boundaries or provoke reassurance. Instead of testing, they tend to settle into a more controlled version of connection. The relationship becomes simpler, more predictable, less emotionally charged, and because of that, there is less internal conflict driving push-pull behavior. But here is the deeper irony. What feels like emotional stability with the option is often just emotional limitation. There's no need to test depth when depth was never fully activated in the first place. With the person they truly love, everything is amplified. Attachment is stronger. Fear is stronger. Desire is stronger. And because the emotional stakes are higher, the avoidance system tries to regulate that intensity through distance-based experiments. It is not that they value the option more. It is that the option does not awaken the same internal chaos that requires regulation. But in doing so, something very important is revealed about avoidance psychology. They often mistake emotional intensity for emotional risk, and emotional calm for emotional safety. So they unconsciously gravitate toward what requires less emotional effort to maintain. Not because it is more meaningful, but because it is less activating. Meanwhile, the person they truly love becomes the emotional benchmark, the person who proved depth, who evoked vulnerability, who triggered attachment patterns strong enough to require psychological defense mechanisms. And even though they may test that connection, what they are really testing is not the other person's love. It is their own capacity to receive it without retreating. That is the part they rarely recognize. Because testing love is often a disguised attempt to regulate their own emotional overwhelm. But the cost of this pattern is significant. Every test creates distance. Every withdrawal introduces uncertainty. And over time, the very connection they are trying to confirm becomes strained under the weight of repeated emotional disruption. And yet, paradoxically, the person who endures these tests is often the one who mattered most. Because people do not test what they don't feel deeply about. They test what they fear losing, what they don't fully understand, what they are not fully ready to surrender to. So in a strange way, testing is not evidence of absence, it is evidence of activation. But what avoidants often fail to realize is that love is not proven through endurance alone. It is built through consistency, emotional safety, and mutual presence. And when testing replaces trust, even the strongest connection begins to erode. Because love does not survive constant questioning. It survives when both people feel safe enough to stop asking whether it is real. And that is the silent paradox. The more they try to confirm love through testing, the more they risk pushing away the very love they were trying to verify in the first place. In the end, what they were searching for was not proof. It was safety. But safety cannot be tested into existence. It can only be built through presence, patience, and emotional courage. When you look at the full arc of avoidant relationships, there is a moment, sometimes months later, sometimes years later, where something shifts internally. And it's not dramatic on the outside. There is no cinematic realization, no sudden confession, no immediate attempt to undo the past. It is quieter than that, more internal, more unsettling. It is the moment they begin to understand, often too late, the difference between what felt safe and what was actually meaningful. Because during the relationship, the avoidant is primarily driven by regulation. They are trying to manage emotional intensity, preserve independence, and maintain psychological equilibrium. So they make choices that reduce discomfort in the short term. They move toward what feels easier to hold, not necessarily what feels deeper to keep. And in that process, the option often becomes the symbol of ease. Low pressure, low emotional activation, predictable interaction. It fits neatly into their regulated world. It does not challenge their emotional defenses. It does not demand full vulnerability. It allows them to feel connected without feeling exposed. But what it rarely does is transform them. And transformation is where the real imprint of love lives. The person they truly loved, on the other hand, rarely fits neatly into that regulated framework. That connection is often emotionally charged, deeply activating, sometimes confusing, sometimes overwhelming, but also profoundly alive. It reaches places inside them that are not easily accessed in controlled environments. It disrupts their emotional autopilot. It forces awareness. It creates internal movement. And so in the moment, the avoidance system often interprets that disruption as instability, something too intense, something too complicated, something that threatens their sense of control. So they step away, not always from lack of love, but from lack of capacity to stay present inside that level of emotional activation. But here is where time changes everything. Because what feels manageable in the short term is not always what holds meaning in the long term. And what feels intense in the moment is not always what destroys connection. It is often what defines it. As distance grows, the nervous system calms. The emotional noise fades. And what remains is reflection without pressure, memory without defense, thought without immediate reaction. And in that quieter space, comparison begins to happen, often unconsciously. They begin to notice that one connection required effort but created depth, while another required ease but never created transformation. One relationship expanded them emotionally, even if it was uncomfortable. The other maintained stability, but without the same sense of emotional awakening.